The day Hope walked. In the afternoon sun hung low over the little town of Milford, painting the empty streets in tired shades of gold and gray. The diner windows reflected a world that seemed to have forgotten the people inside them. Sarah Miller stood behind the counter of her family's diner, her hands trembling slightly as she polished a mug that didn't really need polishing. The smell of old coffee, warm syrup, and fading dreams lingered in the air. She'd been up since dawn, as always, baking pies that would go unsold and making promises to her daughter that she wasn't sure she could keep. The bell above the door hadn't rung in hours, and every tick of the clock sounded like the countdown to the end of everything she'd worked for. The once cheerful red booths were empty, the jukebox silent, and the chalkboard that used to list daily specials now bore only one word in white chalk: closed. Sarah's mother had always told her that courage was quiet, that sometimes bravery meant waking up and doing the same impossible thing again. Day after day, when the whole world told you to stop trying. For months, Sarah had done exactly that. After her husband, Tom, passed away, she had fought to keep the diner running. She had sold her car, taken double shifts, and smiled for the customers even when her heart felt hollow. But now, as she glanced at the clock, she knew that fight was coming to an end. The bank had given her every notice they could, and Frank Dawson, the man who had once been her neighbor, was coming that very afternoon to finalize the foreclosure. She had spent the morning packing up things that didn't belong in a bank inventory. Family photos, Lily's crayons, the worn apron that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and laughter. Upstairs, their small apartment was already stripped bare, each empty wall echoing with the ghosts of the life they'd built. Sarah had nothing left to give except a promise to her daughter that she would somehow make things right. "Mom?" The small, soft voice broke her from her thoughts. 8-year-old Lily stood by the counter, her blonde curls tangled, her eyes wide with worry that didn't belong to a child. She held her old teddy bear, Mr. Pickles, close to her chest, as if the frayed seams could keep the world from falling apart. "Are they really going to take our home?" she asked. Sarah swallowed hard and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, sweetheart. Mommy's going to figure something out." But as she said it, her voice cracked just enough for Lily to notice. The child pressed her lips together, nodding as if she wanted to believe it, and went back to coloring in her notebook. The crayons were dull, their wrappers torn, but she drew with determination. Bright suns, smiling faces, and a house with smoke curling from the chimney. She always drew that house, even though she knew they might not have one tomorrow. When the door swung open, Sarah's heart leapt, thinking maybe it was a customer. Instead, it was Frank Dawson, carrying a folder of documents that looked heavier than his conscience. His eyes flicked around the diner, assessing everything with the detached precision of a man who'd done this too many times before. "Afternoon, Sarah," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You know why I'm here?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, but you said I had until tomorrow." "Plans changed," Frank replied, shifting uncomfortably. "The bank wants this settled today." "I'm sorry, I really am, but business is business." Sarah laughed bitterly, the sound sharp as broken glass. "Business is business. You said that the last time, too." "Tell me, Frank, did business feed your wife when she was sick? Because I remember bringing casseroles to your house every night." His face flushed red. "This isn't personal." "It never is until it's your family," she shot back. Her hands shook, but she refused to cry. "Not in front of him." "Not yet." Lily looked up, her small face confused as the adults raised their voices. "Mommy?" she whispered. Sarah bent down quickly, brushing her hair back. "It's okay, baby. Go sit in the booth." But before Lily could move, the sound of another car pulling up outside made them both turn. Through the window, they saw a sleek black sedan stop at the curb. Too polished, too new for this part of town. A tall man stepped out, his coat catching the wind, his presence cutting through the dusty quiet like a knife through silk. His shoes alone probably cost more than Sarah's entire week's earnings. He paused at the door, studying the faded sign that read Miller's Diner, then pushed it open. The little bell jingled, oddly cheerful against the tension in the room. "Sorry, we're closed," Sarah said automatically, her voice tired. But the man smiled, a calm, easy smile that seemed completely out of place. "I was hoping you might make an exception," he said, his tone warm but firm. "I've been driving for hours and I could use a cup of coffee." There was something about the way he spoke, polite yet confident, that made her hesitate. Maybe it was the accent, faintly British, faintly something else. Or maybe it was the exhaustion that made her too tired to argue. Fine, she said finally. Coffee's all we've got left. He nodded and took a seat at the counter, removing his gloves with deliberate precision. His eyes were sharp, observant, but not unkind. When she poured his cup, he caught the faint tremor in her hands. Rough day? He asked quietly. Sarah gave a hollow laugh. You could say that. Want to talk about it? He asked, taking a sip. The coffee was stronger than he expected, surprisingly good. Not really, she said. But thanks for asking. The door banged again as Frank returned, this time with a uniformed deputy behind him. Sarah, I need you to start clearing personal items now, he said briskly. We have to begin the inventory. The stranger's eyes lifted from his coffee. Inventory, he repeated. What's going on? Frank ignored him. Please, Sarah, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. You already did that, she replied quietly. Her daughter's eyes filled with tears. Mommy, are they taking my teddy? She asked. No, sweetheart, Sarah whispered, hugging her close. They're just counting things for the bank. But the child's voice rose, trembling. They're hurting my mom. The words were small, but they sliced through the room like thunder. The millionaire set his cup down slowly. He hadn't meant to stay. He hadn't meant to care. But that one sentence hit something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. His name was Ethan Grant, and in the world beyond this little town, people knew him as a genius, a tycoon, a man who turned ideas into empires. What they didn't know was that he had built all of it to outrun a memory he could never escape, the sound of his own mother crying as the sheriff took their house away when he was 12. The same helpless pleading, the same smell of coffee and dust and shame. He had sworn then that money would protect him from ever feeling that powerless again, and for years it had. But standing in that diner, watching a little girl clutch her mother's hand, Ethan Grant realized how hollow that victory truly was. He stood up slowly. Excuse me, he said to Frank, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made the deputy straighten. Would you mind telling me what the outstanding amount is? Sir, this is private business, Frank replied stiffly. Ethan's gaze was steady, unreadable. And yet you're conducting it in public in front of a child. Humor me. Sarah looked up, startled. Please, you don't have to. But Ethan ignored her. How much? Frank hesitated, then mumbled the number. Ethan nodded. All right, I'll pay it. The words landed like a hammer. Everyone froze. You'll what? Sarah stammered. Pay it, the full amount. Right now. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and began typing. Frank blinked, his professional veneer cracking. That's not, sir, you can't just. I can, Ethan said calmly. I just did. Within seconds, a confirmation tone chimed from his phone. There, debt cleared. Sarah stared at him, her face pale. Why would you do that? Ethan looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the noise and the fear and the years between their worlds disappeared. Because once, he said softly, someone should have done it for my mother. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever helped her without expecting something in return. I can't accept charity, she whispered. Then don't, he replied. Call it an investment. He looked around the diner. This place has heart. And I have money but no heart. Seems like a fair trade. Sarah almost laughed through her tears. You don't even know me. Then let's fix that, he said, extending his hand. Ethan Grant. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. Clouds gathering like the weight of a storm waiting to break. But inside that worn-out diner, a flicker of light returned. For the first time in months, Sarah Miller allowed herself to hope. She didn't know who this man really was or why he had chosen to help, but something in his eyes told her he wasn't lying. And as Lily reached across the counter and placed her tiny hand over his, whispering, Thank you, Mr. Ethan Grant realized he had just made the most important investment of his life. Not in a diner, but in the kind of humanity he thought he'd lost forever. A stranger's promise. The rain began that evening, first as a drizzle tapping gently on the diner windows, then growing into a steady curtain that blurred the streetlights into watery halos. The smell of coffee mingled with the scent of wet asphalt, and inside Miller's diner the world seemed to shrink down to the quiet clinking of cups and the hum of the old refrigerator. Sarah sat across from Ethan Grant, still trying to process what had just happened. Only hours ago she had believed everything was lost. Her home, her livelihood, her mother's legacy. Now the man sitting across from her, a stranger who could have driven past without a second glance, had not only paid off her debts but was speaking to her like an equal, asking about menus, recipes, and the story behind her grandmother's apple pie. There was something almost unreal about it, as if kindness had walked back into her life after years of exile. Ethan stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his thoughts drifting as Sarah spoke. He wasn't really hearing the words at first. Not because he didn't care, but because his mind was tangled in memories he'd long buried. The rain outside reminded him of another night, decades ago, when he had stood helplessly beside his mother as their own house was emptied by men who said, "It's just business." He had watched her beg, just as Sarah had today, and he had sworn to himself that one day he'd be the one with power, the one who never had to beg again. And he had done it. He'd built an empire, turned code into fortune, ideas into influence. But sitting in that diner, he realized power without compassion was just another form of emptiness. He had spent years chasing success, building walls of glass and steel around his heart. Now, watching Sarah's tired eyes flicker with reluctant hope, he wondered when he had stopped believing in people altogether. Sarah noticed the faraway look in his eyes and hesitated mid-sentence. "You okay?" she asked softly, unsure whether to intrude. Ethan blinked, pulled from the past. "I'm fine," he said, smiling faintly. "Just thinking." "About what?" she pressed, her curiosity disarming him. "About how strange life is," he replied after a moment. "How you can be driving down a road one moment and stumble into something that feels like fate." Sarah gave a small, tired laugh. "Fate hasn't exactly been kind to me lately. Maybe it's making up for lost time," he said quietly. Their eyes met then, and for the first time since her husband's death, Sarah felt a warmth that wasn't just gratitude. It was connection. Not romantic, not yet, but deeply human. The kind of connection that happens when two broken people recognize the same cracks in each other's armor. Lily came running from the back, holding a drawing she had just finished. "Look," she said proudly, thrusting it toward Ethan. "That's you, Mommy, and me. And that's our diner, see? You're helping us fix it." Ethan studied the crayon drawing with an unexpected lump in his throat. The little girl had drawn him taller than everyone else, standing beside her mother with a bright sun above them and the words "Thank you" scribbled in rainbow letters. For a man used to boardrooms and contracts, it was the simplest, most genuine expression of trust he had ever received. "That's beautiful, Lily," he said gently. "You're quite the artist." She grinned, missing a front tooth, and went back to her crayons. Sarah watched her daughter, her heart swelling with both pride and guilt. "She's been through more than any child should," she said quietly. "After her father died, I tried to keep everything normal. I didn't want her to see how bad things were getting. But she always knew. Kids know." Ethan nodded slowly. "My mother used to say the same. I thought she was just being poetic. Turns out she was right." He leaned back, studying the diner's old wooden beams and faded checkered floor. "Tell me something, Sarah. If I invest in this place, really invest, not just to keep it open, what would you do with it?" Sarah blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's your dream? What would Miller's Diner look like if money weren't the problem?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, caught between disbelief and the flood of ideas she'd pushed aside for years. I always wanted to expand the menu. Use local ingredients. Bring back the farmer's breakfast we used to be known for. Maybe even do a roadside bakery section. My grandmother's pies could have been famous if we'd had the means. And upstairs I'd renovate the apartment, make it warm again. It used to feel like home." She stopped, embarrassed by her own enthusiasm. "But that's just a fantasy." Ethan smiled. "Not anymore." Sarah frowned. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious," he said. "I believe in investing in people who still believe in something. And you, and despite everything, men still believe in this place." "You don't even know me," she whispered. "Maybe not. But I know resilience when I see it." He tapped his fingers on the counter thoughtfully. "You said this diner's been in your family since the 50s, right?" "Since 1952, she confirmed. "My grandparents opened it after the war. It was the heart of this town once." "Then we'll make it that again," he said simply. The certainty in his tone startled her. "You talk like you can just make anything happen," she said skeptically. He met her gaze. "When you've spent your life building empires, you learn that everything is possible and you just need the right reasons." That night, long after the last light in the diner went out, Sarah lay awake upstairs staring at the ceiling. The storm outside had eased, but her mind was restless. Who was this man, really? Why had he stopped? Why had he helped her, a stranger with nothing to offer? Every instinct told her it was too good to be true. Yet something about him didn't fit the mold of a cold businessman. His kindness felt real. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he carried secrets of his own. She rolled over and looked at Lily, fast asleep, one hand still clutching her teddy bear. The little girl's face was peaceful for the first time in weeks. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered, "Please, God, don't let this be another false hope." Downstairs, in the dim light of the diner, Ethan sat alone at a booth, his laptop open but forgotten. On the screen, a photograph was visible. An old faded picture of a woman standing in front of a small house that looked strikingly familiar. Around her neck, a silver locket glinted, the same design as the one Sarah wore. Ethan stared at it, his jaw tightening. The past, it seemed, had found him at last. The next morning, the diner came alive with a hum it hadn't known in years. Ethan had stayed the night in a nearby inn and returned early, dressed casually in rolled sleeves and no trace of his usual boardroom formality. Sarah found him already helping an old man fix a loose sign outside. The townsfolk, curious about the stranger who had saved the diner overnight, began trickling in, not for coffee, but for answers. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly postmaster, whispered to the baker across the street, "He's from New York, I heard. A billionaire, they say." "Billionaires don't come to Milford," the baker replied skeptically. But when Ethan held the door for Sarah and smiled as she balanced a tray of fresh muffins, the whispers softened into smiles. It was as if his presence alone brought a current of change with it. Inside, Lily darted between tables, handing out menus with childlike excitement. "Welcome to Miller's Diner. We're open again," she announced proudly. Customers chuckled and patted her head, unaware of how close the place had come to vanishing. Ethan watched her, his expression unreadable. Something about her innocence reminded him of the boy he once was, before success taught him to measure people by profit and loss. He turned to Sarah. "I made a few calls last night," he said casually. "There's a local contractor who owes me a favor. We'll start the renovations next week." Sarah froze mid-step. "Renovations? Already? Why wait?" he said simply. "You've spent enough time waiting." "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let me help," he replied softly. "Because I can't walk away now, Sarah, not from this. Not from you two." For a moment she didn't answer. The sunlight streamed through the windows, catching in the dust motes and the soft golden hair of her daughter as she laughed. Sarah looked around at the diner, at the place where generations of her family had poured their lives, their stories, their love. For the first time in years, she didn't see broken dreams. She saw possibility. She saw hope. "All right," she said finally, her voice trembling but sure. "Let's rebuild it. Together." Ethan nodded, and the faintest smile touched his lips. Not the practiced smile of a businessman, but the genuine kind he hadn't worn in years. He didn't know yet that helping this woman and her daughter would force him to confront ghosts he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. But somewhere deep down, he sensed that whatever path he'd been on before had just changed direction. And as the bell above the door jingled and the morning crowd filled the diner once more, it wasn't just the smell of coffee that filled the air. It was the quiet rebirth of hope. The secret inside the locket. The next few weeks transformed the quiet corner of Milford in ways no one had anticipated. The town that had been fading into gray routine seemed to come alive again. And it all started with Miller's Diner. The construction crew arrived early every morning, their trucks parked along Main Street, and the sound of hammers and drills replaced the silence that had once haunted the place. Locals stopped by daily to peek through the windows, offering coffee to the workers or dropping off pies as gestures of gratitude. For the first time in years, the little town had something to talk about besides hard times and layoffs. And in the center of it all was Ethan Grant, the mysterious stranger whose fortune had breathed life back into their community. Yet to those who watched closely, it was clear he wasn't just repairing a diner. He was repairing something in himself. Every morning, Ethan would arrive before the workers, often bringing breakfast for Sarah and Lily, croissants from the bakery down the street, or sometimes simple sandwiches he made himself in the inn's kitchenette. Sarah teased him about it one morning, saying he didn't seem like the type who even knew how to use a kitchen. He only smiled and replied, "Money can buy meals, but not the comfort of sharing them." That answer lingered with her. It wasn't what she expected from a man whose name carried weight in business magazines and financial headlines. There was something about Ethan that didn't fit the billionaire mold. He worked alongside the crew, sleeves rolled up, paint on his hands, dirt under his nails. He listened when people spoke. He treated everyone, from the waitress to the carpenter, with the same quiet respect. And that humility was what began melting the walls Sarah had spent years building. In between the chaos of renovation, moments of quiet connection bloomed. One afternoon, as rain began to patter softly against the half-repaired roof, Ethan and Sarah sat on the counter sipping coffee and watching Lily draw. "She's remarkable," Ethan said softly, nodding toward the little girl. "She reminds me of someone." "Your daughter?" Sarah asked, half joking, half curious. His expression darkened slightly. "I don't have children," he said after a moment. "Never married either." She studied him, sensing an ache beneath his calm exterior. "Then who does she remind you of?" He hesitated before answering. "My mother," he said finally. "When I was little, she used to hum while she worked. Even when everything fell apart, she'd find something to smile about. Lily has that same light." His voice faltered slightly, and for the first time, Sarah saw the man behind the wealth, someone who had known loss, perhaps deeper than her own. That evening, after Ethan left, Sarah sat at the counter long after closing, absent-mindedly turning the silver locket between her fingers. It had been Tom's final gift to her before he passed, a delicate oval pendant with intricate engravings, a swirl of vines and tiny stars etched into its surface. She had always thought it was just a sentimental keepsake, something Tom had found in an antique shop. But lately, she had begun to notice how Ethan's eyes always lingered on it, how his expression would shift whenever it caught the light. It was strange, but something about his reaction unsettled her, as if the locket meant something to him too. And that night, as she finally unlatched the clasp for the first time in years, she discovered something she had never noticed before. A hidden hinge along the rim, barely visible. With trembling fingers, she pressed it, and a tiny folded paper slipped out, yellowed with age but still intact. Her breath caught as she unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, looping, familiar in a way that tugged at something deep in her chest. "For the one who carries her heart with mine, no matter where the years may take us." It was signed simply J.G. Sarah frowned, confused. Her husband's name had been Thomas Miller. Who was J.G.? For a long moment she sat in silence, the sound of the rain outside blending with the pounding of her heart. Had Tom bought the locket secondhand? Had it belonged to someone else before him? She turned it over and saw for the first time faint initials engraved on the back, worn down but still legible. E.G. A chill ran through her. Ethan Grant. She almost laughed at the impossibility of it. How could this man, a billionaire she met by chance, have any connection to a simple locket her late husband had given her years ago? Yet the coincidence gnawed at her like a whisper she couldn't ignore. The next day she couldn't bring herself to ask him about it. Every time Ethan walked into the diner, she found herself studying him differently, searching for some clue, some sign that would make sense of it all. He noticed her distraction. "You seem a million miles away," he said gently one morning as they reviewed renovation plans. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," she said too quickly. He didn't press, but something in his gaze told her he wasn't convinced. That evening, as they stood outside watching the sun dip below the hills, he finally spoke.
"You know, when I first came here, I thought I was just helping a stranger.
But now I think it was something else. Maybe this was where I was meant to end up all along." Sarah turned toward him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your husband's name, you said it was Tom Miller, right? Did he ever mention working for a startup years ago before you two married?" She blinked, startled. "Yeah, how do you know that?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because I think I was the man who fired him." The words hit her like a blow. "What?" she whispered. "It was a long time ago," Ethan said quietly. "Before I became this, I was just starting my company then. Young, arrogant, obsessed with numbers. Tom worked in our design division. He was one of the most creative people I'd ever met. But he had this idea. Something about integrating empathy into artificial intelligence. I thought it was sentimental nonsense. We argued, and in the end, I let him go. I told myself it was business, but I never forgot the look on his face. He paused, his voice thickening. When I saw that locket around your neck the first day I walked in, I recognized it immediately. It belonged to my mother. I gave it to Tom the day he left. As an apology I was too proud to say out loud. I never thought I'd see it again. Sarah stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the pendant. Tom never told me, she said softly. He said he bought it in a thrift shop. He probably didn't want you to know where it came from, Ethan replied. Maybe he thought it would bring bad luck. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The hum of crickets filled the air, and the neon sign of the diner flickered faintly behind them. Finally, Sarah whispered, "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I didn't realize who you were until I saw your name on the paperwork," Ethan admitted. And by then it felt like fate had already set this in motion. I wanted to make things right, not just for you, but for him. He believed in people more than I ever did. Maybe that's why he kept your diner alive for so long. Sarah's throat tightened. He believed in dreams, she said.
Even when the world didn't. Ethan nodded.
And now it's my turn to believe in his dream. He turned toward her, his expression earnest. Let me finish what he started. Let me build this place the way he imagined. With you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, overwhelmed. The grief she had buried for years seemed to stir again. Not painfully this time, but gently, like a memory finally ready to be healed. You really think fate brought you here? She asked quietly. Ethan's gaze softened. I don't know if it was fate or guilt, he said, but I know I was supposed to find you. For the first time, Sarah didn't argue. The truth was she had stopped believing in miracles long ago. But this strange, beautiful collision of past and present felt too perfect to be coincidence. As they stood there, the last light of sunset washing over them, she felt something shift inside her. For years she had carried her pain like a weight. Now, standing beside the man who had unknowingly played a role in her suffering, she felt that weight begin to lift. That night, when she tucked Lily into bed, the little girl asked sleepily, Mommy, is Mr. Ethan going to stay with us forever? Sarah smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe he's just here until the diner is fixed. I hope he stays, Lily murmured. When he's around, you don't look sad anymore. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her chest. She kissed her daughter's forehead softly and whispered, Good night, my love. But as she turned out the light and stepped into the quiet hallway, she realized Lily was right. Somewhere between loss and second chances, between the past she couldn't change and the future she dared to imagine, Sarah Miller had begun to smile again. Downstairs, Ethan stood alone in the dim glow of the diner's sign, staring at the reflection of his own face in the glass. He had built skyscrapers, conquered industries, and bought anything money could touch, but here, in this small town with a woman who carried his mother's locket, he had found the one thing he hadn't realized he'd been searching for: redemption. The man who could fix everything except himself. The diner reopened 3 months later beneath a sky so clear it looked washed clean after years of dust and grief. The red and white sign that once flickered weakly now glowed steady, its reflection shimmering across the rain-damp pavement as if the town itself had been reborn. From the highway curve, travelers could already smell the butter and cinnamon drifting from Miller's ovens, and every stool at the counter was filled with laughter, conversation, and the clatter of plates. Sarah moved through it all with practiced grace, the same apron tied around her waist but a different light behind her eyes. She had fought through despair and found her footing again, yet the man responsible for the miracle rarely smiled. Ethan Grant had delivered on every promise: new equipment, restored flooring, a scholarship fund for local kids, even a community pantry built behind the diner where leftover meals were given to families in need. The newspapers called him the angel investor with a heart. But Sarah could see what others couldn't, the quiet guilt still shadowing him whenever her late husband's name was mentioned. On a bright afternoon, when the crowd finally thinned, Sarah brought 2 slices of pie to the corner booth where Ethan sat going through renovation invoices he insisted on checking himself. You never take a break, she said, setting the plates down. Even God rested on the 7th day. He smiled faintly. I don't remember the part where God had quarterly reports. She sat opposite him anyway, folding her hands. Ethan, you've done enough. More than enough. You saved us, And you gave this whole town something to believe in again. You don't owe anyone anything now." For a long moment he didn't answer, just traced the rim of his coffee cup with his thumb. "You're wrong," he said finally, voice low. "I owe everything. To people like Tom. To people like you." He looked up, his eyes tired but sincere. "When I fired your husband, I thought I was making a business decision. But that one decision ruined a family's dream. I've spent years pretending money could erase mistakes. Turns out some debts aren't paid with numbers." Sarah wanted to protest, but the emotion in his voice stopped her. She reached across the table, touching his hand gently. "Ethan, my husband, never hated you. He used to say failure taught him what real success meant. He said he learned more about compassion after losing that job than he ever did while he had it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then he was a far better man than I was." "No," she said softly. "You just forgot who you were for a while. Now you're remembering." He stared at her hand over his, the simple human warmth of it, and something inside him cracked open. For years he had been surrounded by people who wanted a piece of him, his money, his influence, his name. But here was someone who wanted nothing, who offered comfort without expectation. It frightened him as much as it healed him. Over the next weeks he became a fixture not just of the diner but of the town itself. He attended local meetings, funded the rebuilding of the playground behind the church, and started a mentorship program for single mothers who wanted to start small businesses. The townspeople adored him, calling him our miracle man. Yet every night, when the laughter died and the lights dimmed, he returned to his rented room and stared out the window, wondering why redemption still felt incomplete. Wealth had once been his shield. Now it was a mirror, reflecting the emptiness he'd tried to ignore. He could fix buildings, businesses, even other people's lives, but he still hadn't figured out how to fix the hollow place inside his own. One evening, as autumn painted the maples outside in amber and rust, Lily ran into the diner holding a folded flyer.
"Mommy, Mr. Ethan."
"They're having a charity auction at the town hall for the children's hospital," she said breathlessly. "They said maybe we could help." Sarah smiled, taking the paper. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart." Ethan read it over her shoulder, then nodded. "Let's do something special." "Like what?" Lily asked. He thought for a moment, then looked at the locket glinting against Sarah's collarbone. "Something from the heart," he murmured. The next day he made a few discreet phone calls. A week later the entire town gathered in the old hall, its wooden rafters strung with fairy lights and laughter echoing through the open doors. When Ethan stepped up to the podium, wearing the same simple gray suit he'd worn the day he first walked into Miller's diner, the room fell silent. "I spent most of my life believing success was measured in dollars," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "But a little girl reminded me that it's measured in kindness. Tonight I'd like to donate something that taught me that lesson, a symbol of the moment when I remembered what matters." He reached into his pocket and held up a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate silver locket, twin to the one around Sarah's neck, newly restored by a jeweler but still bearing the same engraving. E.g. "This belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "And years ago I gave one just like it to a man I wronged. I never thought I'd see it again, but life has a way of returning what we're meant to face." He looked at Sarah in the front row, and though tears shimmered in her eyes, she smiled through them. "I'm auctioning this piece tonight not for its value, but for its story, because every act of grace begins with admitting where we've failed." The locket sold for a staggering amount, every cent of it going to the hospital. Reporters from nearby cities wrote about the mysterious philanthropist whose redemption had built a community. Yet what mattered most wasn't the money, but what happened afterward. People began helping one another without being asked. The diner became a meeting place for kindness, free breakfasts for job seekers, study nights for students, and Saturday dinners where no one left hungry. Sarah often joked that Ethan had turned her grandmother's dream into a movement, but deep down she knew it wasn't just about the diner anymore. It was about giving people a reason to believe in goodness again. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan stood alone in the quiet hall, the sound of rain tapping faintly against the roof. Sarah found him there, hands in his pockets, staring at the empty stage. "You did something beautiful tonight," she said softly. He shook his head. "You did. I just followed your lead." She stepped closer, the air thick with the scent of rain and wood polish. "Ethan," she whispered, You don't have to keep proving you're a good man. You already are. He turned toward her slowly, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was sacred. You and Lily gave me back my humanity, he said finally. I don't think I can ever repay that. Then don't, she replied. Just live it. For the first time in years, Ethan laughed, a quiet, honest sound that startled them both. He reached for her hand and she didn't pull away. Outside, the neon glow of the diner sign reflected off the puddles, the same light that had once flickered uncertainly, now shining steady and strong. For Sarah, it symbolized everything they had endured. For Ethan, it was a reminder that even the smallest flame, when guarded with love, could outshine an entire lifetime of darkness. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began talking about staying in Milford permanently. He bought a small piece of land overlooking the hills, not for another empire or mansion, but for a simple home with wide windows and a garden Lily could fill with wildflowers. Sometimes he still woke before dawn, haunted by dreams of his past. But when he walked into the diner each morning and heard Sarah humming over the coffee machine and Lily's laughter bouncing off the walls, the nightmares faded. He had found something far rarer than success. He had found peace. The gift that could not be bought. Winter arrived quietly in Milford, not with storms or blizzards, but with a slow, graceful hush that softened every rooftop and turned the streets silver beneath the street lamps. The smell of pine and cinnamon filled the air as the town prepared for Christmas, a season it had not truly celebrated in years. Miller's Diner stood at the heart of it all, its windows glowing like amber, a beacon of warmth against the cold. Inside, garlands looped across the walls and a small tree sat proudly near the counter, decorated not with fancy ornaments but with paper stars made by Lily and the local schoolchildren. Each star carried a handwritten wish, some for toys, some for family, but most for simple things: hope, health, peace. Ethan Grant stood by the window watching the snow fall, his reflection framed by lights. For the first time in decades, he was not thinking about mergers, deadlines, or investors. He was thinking about belonging, about roots he had never thought he would plant again. Sarah came out from the kitchen carrying a tray of steaming cocoa. Her cheeks flushed from the heat of the oven and the soft excitement of the evening. The diner was closing early tonight because the townspeople had planned something special, a Christmas Eve gathering to thank Ethan for everything he had done. She set the tray down beside him and smiled, the faint scent of vanilla following her like a whisper. You still haven't told me why you're so quiet today, she said, handing him a mug. Ethan took it, staring into the swirl of melting marshmallows. I've been thinking about what comes next, he admitted. Sarah tilted her head, concern softening her expression. Next, you mean after the holidays? He nodded slowly. I built a life out of constant motion. Standing still is new to me. Sometimes I wonder if I'm meant to stay or move on before I disrupt whatever peace you've built here. She laughed gently. Ethan, you didn't disrupt anything. You gave us back what we lost. And if you really want to leave someday, I won't stop you. But this place will always miss you when you go. Her words were simple, but they hit him harder than any speech he had ever heard in a boardroom. That night, as the first guests arrived for the Christmas Eve celebration, the diner filled with music and laughter. Children ran between tables, leaving tiny boot prints on the floor as Mrs. Thompson from the post office played old carols on the upright piano by the door. The whole town had shown up. Farmers, teachers, mechanics, families who had once struggled to keep their homes, all drawn together by the simple magic of being part of something good again. Ethan watched from the corner as Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with the kind of genuine smile that made people feel seen. Lily stood on a stool behind the counter, handing out cookies and telling anyone who would listen that Mr. Ethan was the reason Santa was coming to Milford this year. He couldn't help but laugh, though there was a sting of emotion beneath it. He had been called many things in his life: visionary, mogul, genius, but never Santa, and in that moment, he realized this was the only title that had ever mattered. As the evening went on, Sarah gathered everyone's attention and motioned for Ethan to join her at the front. He hesitated. He never liked being the center of praise, but her hand found his, and somehow it felt natural to walk beside her. Friends, she began, her voice warm and steady. This year has taught me that miracles don't always look the way we expect. Sometimes they come in the form of a stranger who stops for coffee and ends up changing an entire town. When Ethan came here, we were at our lowest. Now look around you. This is what hope can build when someone believes again." Applause filled the room, but Ethan felt his throat tighten instead of swelling with pride. He looked at Sarah, at the crowd, at the little girl smiling in the front row, and for the first time in his life he understood what success really meant, not in money earned, but in lives touched. After the crowd left and the snow outside thickened into a quiet storm, only the three of them remained. Lily had fallen asleep in a booth, curled up beneath a checkered blanket, and Sarah was turning off the lights when Ethan stopped her. "Wait," he said softly. "There's one more thing I need to do." From his coat he pulled a folder, thick with documents sealed under a red ribbon. He set it on the counter and slid it toward her. "What's this?" she asked. "It's yours," he replied. "Deed to the diner, the building, the land, everything, and before you argue, it's already filed. No bank can ever touch it again." Sarah stared at him, speechless. "Ethan, I can't." He lifted a hand to stop her. "Yes, you can. I've been holding on to things my whole life, thinking ownership meant security. It doesn't. Letting go does." Tears filled her eyes as she opened the folder and saw her grandfather's signature on a photocopy he had tracked down from the archives. He had even restored the original family title from 1952. She looked up at him, voice breaking. "You did all this for us?" He smiled gently. "For you, for him, for the little boy I used to be who watched his mother lose everything because no one stepped in to help." They stood there for a long time in silence, the kind that didn't need words. Snow kept falling outside, soft and steady, covering the street in a blanket of white. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Ethan, you came here because of guilt, but you're leaving as something else. You're part of this family now. You always will be." He looked at her then, and for once there was no defense in his eyes, no armor of irony or wealth to hide behind. Just a man who had finally found peace in the simplest truth, that love was not a transaction but a choice. He nodded, and his voice was rough when he said, "Merry Christmas, Sarah." She smiled through her tears. "Merry Christmas, Ethan." Then, for the first time since her husband's death, she let herself hug someone without fear of breaking. He held her for a long moment, the world outside disappearing into the snow. Weeks later, long after the holiday decorations came down, Ethan decided to move permanently to Milford. He sold his shares in the company he'd built, donating most of his fortune to foundations for education and small businesses. When journalists called to ask why, he only said, "I found something money can't buy." The story made headlines, but in Milford it was old news. To them, he wasn't a celebrity or a mystery anymore. He was just Ethan, the man who brought hope back. Every Sunday morning he could be found at his usual booth, helping Lily with her homework while Sarah bustled around serving customers who had become friends. The photo of Tom Miller still hung by the register, and beneath it Sarah had added a small plaque that read, "In memory of those who believed in kindness first." Ethan never mentioned it, but every time his eyes met the photo he felt something like a blessing. Years passed, and the story of Miller's Diner became something of a legend, a lesson told in schools, a feature on holiday specials, a parable about redemption and community. But those who had been there knew the truth. It was never about money or miracles from the outside. It was about one small moment when a child looked up at a stranger and said, "They're hurting my mom," and the world changed because he listened. Every Christmas, Ethan would sit by the window with Lily, now a teenager with dreams as bright as the lights outside, and tell her that story again. She would laugh and say, "Mom still cries when you tell that part." He would smile and reply, "She cries because it was the day we all found our way home." On one such night, long after the diner had closed and the snow had settled soft and deep, Sarah looked around the place that had once been her burden and was now her blessing. The clock ticked quietly, the air smelled of sugar and coffee, and Ethan was there by the window as always, a book in his hand. She walked over and stood beside him, their reflections blending in the glass like two stories finally woven into one. "Do you ever miss the old life?" she asked. He closed the book and looked at her with a smile that carried 100 answers. "Sometimes," he said, "but then I look at this place and I realize that everything I was searching for out there was waiting for me right here." Outside, a new day began to dawn over Milford, and for the first time in a long, long life, Ethan Grant was finally home.